everybody hear me all right? Okay. Welcome to Melville at 200, presented by Boise State University's Hemingway Literary Center and Melville's Marginalia online in observance of the 200th anniversary of the birth of the author of Moby Dick. Neglected in his own time, after a brief run at fame early in his career, Herman Melville's writing, thought, example, and value continue to resonate, continue to reverberate in our own time in many ways. From Ahab's obsessive pursuit of the white whale in Moby Dick to the sacrifice of innocence at the altar of expediency in his last book, Billy Budd. Melville's profound themes and preoccupations, the beauty of his language, the relevance of his observations, the acuteness of his moral perspective apply in all sorts of ways to the current events and conflicts we experience in our own lives today. But one consequence of the towering presence and long shadow cast by the author of Moby Dick is the aura of grand achievement and unapproachability that he often presents for first-time readers. Here to help us navigate that tension and to put Melville the human being back into the canonized author, Geoffrey Sanborn is Henry S. Poehler 59 Presidential Teaching Professor of English at Amherst College. That's a mouthful. I trust you don't introduce yourself that way on a regular basis. As a graduate student at UCLA in the 1990s, Professor Sanborn discovered the source for many of Melville's notes in the final volume of his set of William Shakespeare's dramatic works, including the blasphemous baptismal formula used by Ahab to consecrate his harpoon in chapter 113 of Moby Dick. Later, he established Melville's source for the character of Queequeg, revealing Melville's practice of appropriating and altering content from a contemporaneous work on South Pacific Islanders, effectively inverting the ideological biases of his source to create this unforgettable and irreplaceable character in American fiction. The best compliment I can pay to Professor Sanborn is to point out how prominent a role these discoveries play in the classroom. Far from being confined to academic journals, his contributions have permanently impacted pedagogical practices and the ways readers experience Moby Dick. He has since enriched our understanding of Melville within the frameworks of post-colonial studies and studies of the non-human in literature. And in his new book, The Value of Herman Melville, he provides an analysis of general appreciation to Melville's multiple works and viewpoints, copies of which are available at the table behind you. And I encourage each one of you to peruse the holdings there and take advantage of the opportunity to purchase this very affordable book and get it signed as a memento of the evening. But please join the Hemingway Literary Center and Melville's Marginalia online in welcoming Professor Geoffrey Sanborn.
Thank you. I have a handout that I'm going to ask you. Thank you. I can't get away from paper. I know this should be PowerPoint, but it's sometimes nice actually to look down and look up and to have something to refer back to. If you have questions afterwards, which I hope you do, I'm really, really happy to be here, and really grateful to everyone in the Boise State English Department for their inviting me here and the great welcome that they've provided, and grateful to all of you for being here now. It's pretty wonderful to be able to get in a room together to talk about the value of Herman Melville for me. It's a really exciting thing, and I want to make the best use of the opportunity that I can, or that we can. And so I want to say a couple of things briefly about what I was trying to do in the book as a whole, and then I want to read 2 chapters from the book. They're very short chapters. It's a book that sort of proceeds. There's like 13 chapters in a book like that's this size. So they're like little forays that I try something out, then I try something else out, then that makes me think of something else, and so then I do something else after that. I was asked to do this book by an editor at Cambridge University Press who was starting a new series on the value of literature. And what he told me was that he had historicized every author he could think of to historicize, and now he had to explain why those authors were chosen. He had to, like, why do we do the Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen and not the Cambridge Companion to some other author? Why is it that we selected those authors in particular? And I was like, that's impossible. Like, how could you write a book called The Value of Herman Melville, as if there's like one value, or as if I know what it is, and it displaces everybody else's sense of what the value is. But then at the same time, he was right. You can't not ask that question. Students ask that question all the time. Like, why are these particular authors on the syllabus? Can you give me a good reason why? And if we can't, then if we just go, like, be gone, like in The Wizard of Oz, then I don't think that's a good response. I think we have to try harder than that. So what I was doing in this book was trying hard, but also as I wrote it, trying with really this kind of sense of joy and sense of discovery too, to just start from the beginning. Like, why pick him up in the first place? What if we'd never heard of him, and there wasn't even like a name on the book, and we opened up Moby Dick and we started reading? Well, like, what would happen? And what would we say about it to somebody else? And finally, what would its value be? I say sometimes to students when they're writing papers that everything we do, just because of the nature of time, the nature of memory, recedes into the past, a past that provides us with a constant resource for the present, resource for the future. And it's only by means of sort of like actively drawing on that resource that we can have our pasts enrich our present and our future, as opposed to simply sort of like disappearing and us only remembering bits and pieces in a kind of fragmented, helter-skelter sort of way. So that's what I was trying to do in this book. And the book starts with a kind of consideration of Melville's style, what it feels like to be inside a Melville sentence, and moves from there in the direction of a whole bunch of other issues associated with Melville, including Melville's politics. So the 2 chapters I'm going to read are titled "Courting Surprise" and "All Things Trying." And so it's the talk that I'm going to give is sort of going to have a pause in the middle of it. It's the pause between chapter 10 and 11. And I haven't done a reading like this before, but the reason why I want to do it in part is because I'd like to give you more than one thing to think about. I feel really strongly, and I'll talk about this in the first chapter, that thinking, as opposed to just having thoughts, is one of the most important things that we can do, especially at the present moment. To be involved, not just in sort of presenting a thought to somebody else, receiving somebody else's thought from them, but to sort of move from one thought to another, to another, to another, to be engaged in that process. Is in every imaginable way just like a really, really necessary thing. So I'm going to give you more than one thing to think about, more than one kind of like text to refer to. This will hopefully ground us a little bit, the handout that I sent around. And now I'm going to begin. Everyone involved in the trial of Adolf Eichmann, Hannah Arendt writes in Eichmann in Jerusalem, seemed to find it impossible to admit that an average, normal person, neither feeble-minded, nor indoctrinated, nor cynical, could be perfectly incapable of telling right from wrong. When the judges told Eichmann, who oversaw the deportation of Eastern European Jews to concentration camps, that all he had said was empty talk, they were under the impression that the emptiness was feigned and that the accused wished to cover up other thoughts, which, though hideous, were not empty. In fact, Arendt argues, the emptiness of Eichmann's talk covered up nothing at all. He was genuinely incapable of uttering a single sentence that was not a cliché. Despite his rather bad memory, he, quote, repeated word for word, this is the quotation after this is the first on the sheet. He repeated word for word the same stock phrases and self-invented cliches. When he did succeed in constructing a sentence of his own, he thereupon repeated it until it became a cliche, each time he referred to an incident or event of importance to him. And then this is the first quotation. The longer one listened to him, she writes, the more obvious it became that his inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think, namely to think from the standpoint of somebody else. No communication was possible with him, not because he lied, but because he was surrounded by the most reliable of all safeguards against the words and the presence of others, and hence against reality as such. The absence of thinking in Eichmann would ultimately lead Arendt to the following question, which she formulates in the opening pages of The Life of the Mind. Quote, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining whatever happens to come to pass or to attract attention, regardless of results and specific content, could this activity be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing, or even actually condition them against it? It depends, to begin with, on what one means by thinking. For Arendt, it is a pondering reflection that does not produce definitions, and in that sense is entirely without results. It is not a prerogative of the few, but an ever-present faculty in everybody. It's a really important point. And although it can be employed in the attempt to know, it is at such times never itself, but the handmaiden of an altogether different enterprise. As opposed to being a means of arriving at completed thoughts, thinking is, she argues, a means of unfreezing, as it were, what language, the medium of thinking, has frozen into thought. It is not, however, a ceaseless flux. Neither is it, psychically speaking, without results. As she argues in some questions concerning moral philosophy, it is a way of striking roots, of taking one's place in the world into which we all arrive as strangers. Those roots are not only external but internal. Anyone who's done a lot of active, creative thinking, she writes, will be rooted in his or her thoughts and remembrances, will have both an orientation toward further thinking and a wealth of materials to think with. Limitless, extreme evil is possible only where these self-grown roots are entirely absent, she writes. Only where people skid over the surface of events. Only where they are carried away without ever penetrating into whatever depth they may be capable of. She puts the case more bluntly in a 1963 letter, quote, the more superficial someone is, the more likely he will be to yield to evil. Melville was, in his own words, a pondering man. The defining characteristic of a pondering person, for Melville as for Arendt, is that he or she values for its own sake the experience of stopping and beginning to think, the experience of reaching another dimension than the horizon of everyday life. Pondering is promiscuous, proceeds browsingly, and only occasionally leads to a thought that one is moved to speak of. From its various bases in the mind, it rays out into experience, continually creating new circuits between perception and memory, and sometimes generating, over time, new perspectives on experience. It elicits, accordingly, both pleasure and uneasiness, both an uplifting and a dizzying sense of being in motion. Thinking's most dangerous aspect from the viewpoint of common sense, Arendt writes in The Life of the Mind, is that what was meaningful while you were thinking dissolves the moment you want to apply it to everyday living, which is why common sense thinking so often seems to proceed from, in her words, a desire to find results that would make further thinking unnecessary. The mind incessantly creates, Melville writes in Pierre, out of the incessant dissolvings of its own prior creations, which is why one can never say to oneself, in his words, I have come to the ultimate of human speculative knowledge. Hereafter, at this present point, I will abide. So true is this, he goes on to say, that some men refuse to solve any present problem for fear of making still more work for themselves in that way. What Melville most profoundly shares with Arendt is a feel for the way in which thought emerges out of and segues into thinking. In response to an editor's commentary on John Milton's, quote, wanderings in belief, Melville wrote in the margins of his Milton volume, "He who thinks for himself never can remain of the same mind." The value of the thinking process, a process that operates throughout our species and beyond, is that it makes it possible to be something other than the same old self, to find oneself in new conjunctions with others. The more attuned we come to the thinking process, the more aware we become that each thought has, as William James argues, this is on the handout, a halo or penumbra that surrounds and escorts it, a fringe that consists of the sense of its relations, near and remote, the dying echo of whence it came to us, the dawning sense of whither it is to lead. And the more aware we become of those vapory extensions beyond the body of the thought, the more we sense in ourselves the movement toward a thought and then past it, the more aware we become of each thought's non-finality. Really, universally, relations stop nowhere, writes Henry James. Whatever one says or does creates the possibility of further saying or doing. Whatever one perceives creates the possibility of further perceptions. Racism is, to say the least, a freezer of thoughts and a limiter of relations. In Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, the white storekeeper, Mr. Jakubowski, quotes, urges his eyes out of his thoughts to encounter the young girl who's come up to the counter. Quote, somewhere between retina and object, his eyes draw back, hesitate, and hover. Piccola, the young girl, looks up at him and sees the vacuum where curiosity ought to lodge, and something more, the total absence of human recognition, the glazed separateness. End quote. Racism suspends curiosity and hangs out as the sign of that suspension a glazed expression, the expression of someone who's either not looking at anything at all or is looking at something that can only be one thing. Quote, all things in Piccola are flux and anticipation, Morrison writes, but her blackness in the eyes of white people is, quote, static and dread. Thinking is, by contrast, an unfreezer of thoughts and an expander of relations. It is a frightful poetical creed, Melville writes in an 1851 letter, that the cultivation of the brain eats out the heart. But it's my prose opinion that in most cases, in those men who have fine brains and work them well, the heart extends down to the hams, which means I think the hamstring is like the thighs, I think. There's no need for the Hawthornean opposition of head and heart. One can stand for the heart, as Melville does, and stand for the head as well, as long as the head is understood as a means of extending and deepening a capacity for relations. If one not only knows but feels that each thought has a history and a future, that each thought, each perception, each statement is a momentary crystallization of an endless distillate, one can allow oneself to move outward, onward, past each point of arrival, toward the perception beyond the first perception, the thought beyond the first thought, the statement beyond the first statement. Whatever someone else appears to be upon first thought, or upon second thought, or upon third, is never all that he or she is. Most white 19th century writers resist that kind of perceptual interpretive movement in their representations of non-white characters. And I'm giving two examples of that here. One, number 7 on the handouts from James Fenimore Cooper's The Pioneers, and on the flip side of the page, number 8 is from Harriet Beecher Stowe's Dread. And I won't read the whole quotations because the point of having them in there is sort of to allow you to see how the thinking is going on, how the perceiving is going on, how terrifyingly static the kind of perspective is on these characters, each of which is a major character in the book, but is presented in a way that, in a sense, assures the implicitly white reader that there's nothing to see here. Or again, there's only one thing to see. We already know what there is to see. In these two passages, instead of flux and anticipation, we get stillness. In Dread's case, an actual motionlessness, and in Chingachgook's case, it's from the Cooper book, a slow, stately, expressionless walk down a long hall. The meticulousness of the attention to physiology, clothing, and accoutrements makes it seem as though those details are both indexical and comprehensive, as though everything that there is to know about these characters can be conveyed in a paragraph or two by those means. Instead of unfreezing the frozen and unglazing the glazed, Cooper and Stowe invite their implicitly white reader to behold stable, familiar spectacles, To be interested in what Chingachgook and Dredd will do, perhaps, but not in who they and the reader might become. Chingachgook and Dredd are important to the plots of the novels, but they neither inspire nor demand the kind of open-ended interest on which living relationships are based. These passages are obviously racist. However, given the degree to which racism and anti-racism are at present conceptualized exclusively in moral terms, we should try to say something more than that about them. When moral outrage is our predominant response to racism, we both limit the range of analytical tools that can be brought to bear on the issue, sociological, historical, aesthetic, psychological, and implicitly identify racism with a superior, anti-racism with a superior moral capacity. As Arendt so compellingly argues, goodness alone will not save us, insofar as goodness can be, and often is, generated out of non-thinking, out of holding fast, Arendt writes, to whatever the prescribed rules of conduct may be at a given time in a given society. When push comes to shove, Arendt writes, the readiest to obey will be those who are the most respectable pillars of society, the least likely to indulge in thoughts. Because what they've gotten used to in their essentially compliant goodness is less the content of the rules, she writes, a close examination of which would always lead them into perplexity, than the possession of rules under which to subsume particulars. The lesson, she writes, of the total moral collapse of respectable society during the Hitler regime is that under such circumstances, those who cherish values and hold fast to moral norms and standards are not reliable. We now know that moral norms and standards can be changed overnight, and that all that will then be left is the mere habit of holding fast to something. Refusing to make up one's mind anew when confronted with some difficulty, Arendt writes, can wreak more havoc than all the evil instincts taken together. If racism is less an evil to be countered by goodness than an immobilization to be countered by movement, a superficiality to be countered by depth, then it may be more useful as well as more accurate to describe passages like Cooper's and Stowe's as racist manifestations of a resistance to thinking in Arendt's broad, life-oriented sense of the term. Most of the white people in a racist culture who write about non-white people have internalized the idea that there's little or nothing to see or say about non-white people, that there's no need to activate the process of thinking that carries these writers into unexpected places at other moments in their work. That phenomenon is continuous with and underpins a basic fact of life in a racist culture, that many white people, including many self-nominated anti-racists, bring to their encounters with non-white people the assumption that there will be in those encounters few or no fringes of possibility. The advances that racist and anti-racist white people make toward non-white people are, on the whole, not as curious-minded, not as persistently interested, not as oriented towards halos and penumbras, as the advances that they make toward white people. It's sort of like, for me, one of the definitions of racism, that a certain kind of like activity of consciousness that's present in one circumstance is not brought to another circumstance, and that this immobilizes the imagination and immobilizes the possibility of change in relations. We need, accordingly, another way of conceptualizing anti-racism, one that's less about being good. And I'm not down on goodness. I believe in goodness. I love goodness. I just think that goodness isn't enough. Just to be clear. We need one that's less about being good than about wanting life to be life at every turn, wanting life to open in every encounter from perception onto perception onto perception, from thought onto thought onto thought. Melville provides us with a useful starting point for that reconceptualization in The Spouter Inn, the chapter in which the reader first encounters the most pivotal non-white character in Moby Dick. In the bedroom of the Spouter Inn, in which Ishmael has been lodged by the landlord, a bedroom that's already been rented out to an unknown harpooner, Ishmael is about to fall asleep when a footfall and the light in the hallway arouse him. Into the room walks the harpooner, a candle in one hand and an embalmed Maori head in the other. Without noticing Ishmael in the bed, he begins struggling to open his bag. I was all eagerness to see his face, says Ishmael, and I'm now going to be reading a passage that I've reproduced on the flip side of the handout. But he kept it averted for some time while employed in unlacing the bag's mouth. This accomplished, however, he turned round when, good heavens, what a sight! Such a face! It was of a dark purplish yellow color, here and there stuck over with large blackish-looking squares. Yes, it's just as I thought. He's a terrible bedfellow. He's been in a fight, got dreadfully cut, and here he is, just from the surgeon. But at that moment, he chanced to turn his face so towards the light that I plainly saw that they could not be sticking plasters at all, those black squares on his cheeks. They were stains of some sort or other. At first, Ishmael says, I knew not what to make of this. Then, however, an inkling of the truth occurs to him. I remembered a story of a white man, a whaleman too, who, falling among the cannibals, had been tattooed by them. I concluded that this harpooner, in the course of his distant voyages, must have met with a similar adventure. Having made something of what he's seen, Ishmael takes a philosophical step back from it. And what is it, thought I, after all? It's only his outside. A man can be honest in any sort of skin. A moment later, though, an overlooked detail comes to mind. The state of not knowing what to make of this revives, and he steps back into the uncertainty of the experience. But then, what to make of his unearthly complexion? That part of it, I mean, lying about and completely independent of the squares of tattooing. To be sure, it might be nothing but a good coat of tropical tanning, but I never heard of a hot sun's tanning a white man into a purplish yellow one. Then the harpooner takes off his hat, and Ishmael almost sings out with fresh surprise. There's no hair on his head, none to speak of at least, nothing but a small scalp knot twisted up on his forehead. His bald, purplish head now looked for all the world like a mildewed skull. Again the uncertainty revives. I am no coward, he says, but what to make of this head-peddling purple rascal altogether past my comprehension. Earlier in the chapter, standing in front of the painting in the Spouter Inn's entryway, Ishmael had been darted through by idea after idea, each of which arose out of and subsided back into uncertainty. Something similar is happening here. And it just keeps happening. Even after getting a good look at him, his chest, his arms, his back, his legs, and reaching the conclusion that he is some abominable savage or other, the curiosity that makes Ishmael want to see more overpowers the fear that makes him want to flee. He went about something that completely fascinated my attention, he writes. I now screwed my eyes hard to see what was next to follow. Only when the harpooner springs into bed with him does he cry out, and when the landlord comes into the room, giving him the chance to leave, it takes only a moment for him to decide to stay. Ishmael does not, of course, say whether he and the harpooner Queequeg have sex that night. Students always want to know this. But he does say at the beginning of the next chapter that he woke to find Queequeg's arm, quote, thrown round me in the most loving and affectionate manner, end quote. An arm whose tattooing and variegated tanning makes it blend in with the blanket, which is full of odd little parti-colored squares and triangles. Queequeg keeps inspiring Ishmael with, quote, fresh surprise, and Ishmael keeps sensing in Queequeg an unmethodical heterogeneity that commingles with the heterogeneity of the object world. He keeps having, in other words, a disorienting, pleasurable, what to make feeling about him. In the passage I gave you, I italicized 3 places where he uses the phrase, what to make of, what to make of, what to make of. So the perception is not just a registering what's out there, it's registering perception is not just taking impress of what's out there, it's making something of what's one's experiencing. The childhood memory that comes to Ishmael's mind at this moment, the memory of waking in the middle of the night to find his hand being held by the hand of a nameless, unimaginable, silent form or phantom, evokes not only his investment in the experience of being held by Queequeg, but also his association of Queequeg with everything that is fringe-like, penumbral, not yet known, everything that makes further thinking possible. We all have a permanent consciousness of whither our thought is going, William James writes. It is a feeling like any other, a feeling of what thoughts are next to arise before they have arisen. Our consciousnesses are, in fact, in very large measure constituted of feelings of tendency, often so vague that we are unable to name them. End quote. Allowing ourselves to be drawn by those feelings of tendency into thought after thought after thought, surrendering ourselves to the process of making up our minds anew, enables us to become better attuned to the transitive as opposed to the substantive dimensions of experience. It also enables us, as Arendt suggests, to strike deeper roots in the world. Living our experiences in an intense, attentive, open-ended way, being curious, persistently inquiring, gives us more to work with and makes us more capable of working with it. When the analyst questions what he thinks he already knows about the patient, the psychoanalyst Donald Stern writes, and about his reactions to the patient, uncertainty is preserved. It becomes harder to feel convinced of any single answer. These conditions constitute the climate in which unbidden perceptions flourish. In trying to create them, the analyst is doing what is possible to court surprise. By courting surprise, by bringing a readiness for experience, an interest in perceptual interpretive movement, everywhere one goes, one can create, as Melville puts it in Marty, the creative, a capacity to discover and articulate more than what immediately appears. A person who seeks certainty uproots himself from the present moment, the only thing that is, and so he becomes a perpetual drifter, writes the critic James Breslin. A person who courts surprise roots herself in the present moment, in a curiosity about where it comes from and where it will go. She may, when push comes to shove, hold her ground. Okay, now here's the pause. And here's the turn into chapter 11. It's called All Things Trying. I've been presenting Melville's works as, in the critic Philip Davis's words, a means of opening and reopening, innerly shifting and deepening mental pathways, a means of taking oneself beyond acceptable social attitudes and the habitual stories of oneself. I have, in addition, been presenting Melville's works as a continually renewed effort to generate, out of pure successiveness, a feeling for form. I've been arguing, finally, that what matters more than the individual instances of formal completion, the well-turned phrases, the aria-like chapters, the compact, disciplined poems, is the persistence in that effort. For me, as for the poet Charles Olsen, one of the greatest of Melville's values is that he, quote, drove further than any of his predecessors toward forcing totality of effort to yield some principle out of itself, end quote. I try all things, Ishmael tells us. I achieve what I can. The principle yielded up by Melville's totality of effort is, in part, that all things may be tried, that consciousness never stops seeking opportunities for creative activity, and that the world never stops supplying those opportunities. Nothing was now inert fact, Olsen writes, with respect to Melville's conception of existence. All things were there for feeling, to promote it and be felt. But the principle is, in addition, that all things are trying. Not just I try all things, but all things are trying. For Melville, Olsen argues, quote, man in the midst of it, knowing well how he was folded in, as well as how suddenly and strikingly he could extend himself, was suddenly possessed or repossessed of a character of being a thing among things, which I shall call his physicality. Reality was without interruption, end quote. Everything is folded in, everything is capable of suddenly, strikingly extending itself. Everything wants, as Zora Neale Hurston writes in Their Eyes Were Watching God, to show its shine. Part of what Melville's totality of effort enabled him to do, in other words, was to sense, as he composed, the degree to which life all around him was ongoingly composing itself. In The Apple Tree Table, a story from 1856, Melville's narrator sees, after a night-long vigil alongside an inexplicably ticking table, a table that contains, unbeknownst to him, long ago laid beetle eggs, quote, a short, nibbled sort of crack, from which, like a butterfly escaping its chrysalis, the sparkling object, whatever it might be, was struggling. Its motion was the motion of life. I stood becharmed, end quote. The motion of life is present not only in the struggling of the folded-in beetle, but also in the responsiveness of the narrator, who is, all at once, too thrilled to move, too riveted to turn away. It is present as well in the coming to existence of the sentences that I've quoted, both at the moment of writing and potentially at the moment of reading, and of reading them out loud. Each of these things is a sparkling object. Each is an instance of what the philosopher Gilles Deleuze describes as active force, which affirms its difference and makes its difference an object of enjoyment and affirmation, end quote. Each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name, writes Gerard Manley Hopkins. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. End quote. Everywhere in Melville's work that cry resounds. When Whitejacket, about to be scourged, is swayed by a desire to knock the captain overboard, he describes it as an instinct that's identical with an instinct diffused through all animated nature, the same that prompts even a worm to turn under the heel. In the poem Venice, Melville writes that coral insects are impelled to build reefs by the same pantheistic energy of will that impelled Venetians to build reefs of castles. In the lecture Statues in Rome, he writes that the idealizations of riderless and rearing horses in ancient Greek statuary are proof of the enlarged humanity of that elder day, when man gave himself none of those upstart airs of superiority over the brute creation which he now assumes. End quote. Trust me, Babylanja says in Marty, there are more things alive than those that crawl or fly or swim. Think you there's no sensation in being a tree? Feeling the sap in one's boughs, the breeze in one's foliage? Think you it is nothing to be a world? One of a herd, bison-like, wending its way across boundless meadows of ether? End quote. Upon feeling his ship bound forward, as if each mast and timber has a pulse in it that's beating with life and joy, Redburn finds himself bounding forward too, under the influence of a, quote, wonderful thing in him that responded to all the wild commotion of the outer world and went reeling on and on with the planets in their orbits and was lost in one delirious throb at the center of the all, end quote. And so on. You could really, really go on and on like that, as you know, if you've read much Melville. Few artists have so consistently attempted to indicate what Deleuze describes as a, quote, opening for life, a path between the cracks, end quote. Even fewer have dramatized the movement through those cracks, the Emersonian shooting of the gulf or darting to an aim with such urgency and joy. Take, for instance, the following chapter opening from The Confidence Man, and this is on, I think it's the next to last, it's number 11 on the handout. And this is sort of an example of something that I've been doing earlier in the book, which is taking a very small and not very well-known passage from Melville's work and trying to sort of, in a sense, like play the clip, like replay it slowly so you can actually like hear and sense all of the things that are happening in it. So that's what I'm going to do now. The sky slides into blue, the bluffs into bloom. The rapid Mississippi expands, runs sparkling and gurgling, all over in eddies, one magnified wake of a 74. The sun comes out, a golden huzzar from his tent, flashing his helm on the world. All things, warmed in the landscape, leap, speeds the dead old boat as a dream. We can most easily track the paragraph's movement by focusing on its successive surprises. To begin with, the sky, which is rarely the agent of an action, slides, and what it slides into, unpredictably, is blue. The next clause accelerates the movement through contraction, the emission of the verb, but also slows it through alliteration, blue, bluffs, bloom, and syntactic parallelism, into blue, into bloom. The river, too, is in unexpected motion. Instead of merely flowing, it expands. As if in response, Melville's narrator grows expansive, giving a more detailed description of the river's transformation, sparkling and gurgling, all over in eddies. And in a figurative escalation, comparing it to a large naval vessel's transformation of the ocean's surface, one magnified wake of a 74. The sun steps forth, giving rise to another figurative escalation, a golden huzzar from his tent, flashing his helm on the world. And then everything beneath it steps forth as well. All things, warmed in the landscape, leap. The final sentence of the paragraph reestablishes the steamboat as the focal setting of the novel, evokes its participation in this all-involving motion, and provides, by means of a dropped grammatical subject and a look-it-up word, a climactic stylistic flourish. Speeds the dead old boat as a dream. I looked up dead old, and then I forgot what it meant, so I can't clarify that for you. In just 67 words, Melville has enabled us to make imaginative contact with a vital pluralistic world, a world in which all things are leaping. Each of the political positions that Melville takes up over the course of his career may be understood as an expression of his solidarity with that world, his resistance to the diminishment of life's leapings. At the heart of his opposition to colonialists and missionaries in the Pacific, for instance, is that they situate Pacific Islanders at such a vast conceptual remove that the islanders can no longer be perceived as fellow beings, as unique instances of a universal stepping forth. This is what makes it possible for the members of the U.S. exploring expedition to flatten a Fijian village and then call, he writes, upon all Christendom to applaud their courage and their justice, end quote. Or for an American missionary's wife to hitch two Hawaiian men to a go-kart and tap them on the heads with the handle of her fan when they can't make it up a hill. Will the tender-hearted lady who has left friends and home for the good of the souls of the poor heathen, will she think a little about their bodies and get out and ease them until the ascent is mounted, Melville asks. Not she could not dream of it. End quote. There are a great many bodies in the Pacific Islands to be thought about, and each of those bodies is, as Deleuze writes, composed of a plurality of irreducible forces. End quote. The reality of those active forces never seems to touch the consciousnesses of colonialists and missionaries, however, and is even farther from the consciousnesses of most of the freebooting white sailors in the Pacific, who hardly consider the islanders human, Melville writes. Hence Melville's sympathy with, quote, the spirit which prompts the Typee warrior to guard all the passes to his valley with the point of his leveled spear, and, standing upon the beach, with his back turned against his green home, to hold at bay the intruding European. End quote. Hence, to his sympathy in Whitejacket with sailors who resist the arbitrariness and absoluteness of naval discipline. In addition to devoting 4 early chapters to a diatribe against flogging, Whitejacket spends 4 late chapters on the melancholy recital of what he describes as the massacre of the beards. After the captain of the USS Neversink sees the setting sun streaming in at the portholes light up every hair on the sailors' heads till the 2 long even lines of beards seem one dense grove, he orders them to shorten their hair and trim their beards. All the sailors protest, but most of them allow those ship's barbers to shave them clean. There are, however, a few older sailors who insist on retaining their beards, and who are, accordingly, summoned to face the captain at the mainmast. Such an array of beards, Whitejacket cries, when the resistors are all standing in a row before the captain. Quote, spade-shaped, hammer-shaped, dagger-shaped, triangular, square, peaked, round, hemispherical, and forked. End quote. 15 minutes later, all but one of the nonconformists has allowed his beard to be shaved off. The solitary holdout, Ushant, is flogged and sent to the brig, where he sits out the remainder of the voyage, his long gray beard untouched. While in the brig, Whitejacket says Ushant spends, quote, many hours in braiding his beard and interweaving with it strips of red bunting, as if he desired to dress out and adorn the thing which had triumphed over all opposition, end quote. Why do the beards matter to Melville? Because they're an expression of active force, which again affirms its difference and makes its difference an object of enjoyment and affirmation. End quote. And because their loss is a loss of diversity, which is indispensable to our multiform pilgrim species. It's a line from The Confidence Man. The massacre of all but one of the Neversink's beards may be seen as, in Arendt's words, an attack upon human diversity as such, that is, upon a characteristic of the human status without which the very words mankind or humanity would be devoid of meaning. The same may be said of the way in which the paper-making machine in Melville's The Paradise of Bachelors and the Tartarus of Maids affects its young, sheet-white female operatives. As a result of their prolonged subordination to the metallic necessity, the unbudging fatality that governed the machine, the operatives have become, tragically, its tame ministers. Before my eyes, Melville's narrator says, while watching the machine produce paper, I seemed to see, glued to the pallid incipience of the pulp, the yet more pallid faces of all the pallid girls I had eyed that heavy day. Slowly, mournfully, beseechingly, yet unresistingly, they gleamed along, their agony dimly outlined on the imperfect paper, like the print of their tormented face on the handkerchief of St. Veronica. In place of the partial likenesses that enable a sideways hopping movement of similes, including the story structural simile, which links the Paradise of Bachelors in London to the Tartarus of Maids in western Massachusetts, there's just more of the same, pallid pulp that gives rise to yet more pallid faces, all of which are versions of a single tormented face. In place of exclamatory self-extension, there's only necessity, fatality, and an agony dimly outlined. In each of the above instances, the crisis is the same. Whether it is in colonies, missionary settlements, navies, or factories, or slave ships, prisons, slums, places that are evoked in other Melville works, what is besieged is active force and the unity and diversity that it brings into the world. It is for Melville a crisis with simultaneously individual and social dimensions. In an individual context, it entails suffering, the bearing of a pain of indefinite duration, and an at least partial loss of the ability to share a world with others. In The Piazza, from 1856, Melville's lonely narrator discovers in a hillside cabin an even more lonely young woman, Mariana, for whom the activity of thinking has devolved into, quote, thinking, end quote, an endless barren cycling, a wheel that cannot stop. Catching sight of a far-off, soft, azure world, the farmland that he's just come from, the narrator says to Mariana, "You must find this view very pleasant." "Oh, sir," she says, "the first time I looked out of this window, I said, never, never shall I weary of this." "And what wearies you of it now?" he asks. "I don't know," she says, "but it is not the view, it is Mariana." Withdrawn from the world, and then withdrawn still further by her suffering, Mariana has lost the capacity to make something of her perceptual experience. She now brings nothing but weariness to it and extracts nothing but weariness from it. Near the end of the story, she directs the narrator's attention to two hop vines that seem to have tried and failed to touch and intertwine. It is as if, the narrator writes, having reached the tips of their separate poles, the vines, quote, would have then joined over in an upward clasp, but the baffled shoots, groping a while in empty air, trailed back whence they sprang, end quote. If what we see in moving water is, as Ishmael tells us in the opening chapter of Moby Dick, the ungraspable phantom of life, then what we are presented with in the image from the piazza is the obverse scenario, in which one sees nothing more than the frozen, separate elements of what could have, but did not, combine to generate a new and renewable life. The social dimension of the crisis is, as I've already suggested, the threat that it poses to human diversity. If the uniqueness of each human being were to lose its significance, if uniformity were to be preferred to it, the concept of humanity, which is definitionally a unification of a plurality, would lose its significance as well. Quote, seat thyself sultanically among the moons of Saturn, and take high abstracted man alone, and he seems a wonder, a grandeur, and a woe, Ishmael writes. But from the same point take mankind in mass, and for the most part they seem a mob of unnecessary duplicates. Although the first of those two ways of taking humankind may seem too romantic, the second one is for Melville too terrible to accept. As out of the crude forms of the natural earth, the priest could evoke by art the transcendent mass and symmetry and unity of the pyramid, he writes in his journal after an 1856 visit to the Great Pyramid, so out of the rude elements of the insignificant thoughts that are in all men, they could rear the transcendent conception of a god. But for no holy purpose was the pyramid founded, end quote. By sucking the rudiments of thinking up into the single unchanging thought of God and embodying that thought in the transcendent mass and symmetry and unity of the pyramid, the priests violate the plurality and ambiguity of not yet formulated thoughts and violate thereby, from my perspective, any kind of like authentic religious experience. In doing so, they attack what Arendt calls worldly reality, which can only appear, quote, where things can be seen by many in a variety of aspects without changing their identity, so that those who are gathered around them know that they see sameness in utter diversity, end quote. The end of the common world has come, she writes, when it is seen only under one aspect and is permitted to present itself in only one perspective. The sapping of active force by weariness, the compression of worldly plurality into sameness, these are the looming psychosocial possibilities against which Melville most often bends his energies. At times, as I've indicated, he does so by evoking and intensifying the animating leaping of all things. At other times, however, he does so by trying to get us to recoil from the nightmarish prospects of social isolation and conformity. He knows very well that there are people who have no respect for the fact of pain, who sense it in themselves and others, but will not suffer it, and so cannot be said to discover it. He also knows very well that there are people who have no respect for the fact of diversity, who register the endlessly ramifying otherness of existence, but will not accept its decentering of the self. In his moments of greatest despair, when he retreats to the cave of pessimism, Melville is, temporarily, somewhat like those people. He flees the specificity of suffering through philosophical generalizations and flees the indeterminacy of otherness by ruling out the possibility of change. Again and again, however, he finds his way back. It is not just suffering that he writes about in Moby Dick, but the particular suffering of characters like Perth and Pip. And it is not just otherness, with a capital O, that he writes about in Bartleby and Benito Cereno, but an otherness that cannot easily be swept up into otherness in general, an otherness that haunts, that exceeds one's capacity to locate and name it. He does not blithely assert the inherent vitality of all things. He cherishes each instance of it, lives its experience to the limits of his powers, and retains an acute awareness of how vulnerable it is. I believe that there's something sleeping beneath the chaos of American life that's of extraordinary value, if only we have the courage to go down and bring it up, James Baldwin says in an 1862 interview. What sleeps down there, Baldwin suggests, is the explanation of, quote, why the lives we lead on this continent are mainly so empty, so tame, and so ugly, end quote, which is that white Americans, Baldwin argues, have conditioned themselves not to be sensual, not to, quote, respect and rejoice in the force of life, end quote, in order to fend off any awareness of their violation of that force in their treatment of black and native peoples. If white Americans could only acknowledge the fact of that violation, they might, Baldwin speculates, be able to acknowledge the related fact that the world is neither white nor white-centered. They might then be more willing to have open-ended, sensually live interactions with others, interactions that are less limited by a gravitation towards safety and power, interactions in which they're moved by, quote, something active, something like a fire, like the wind, something which can change them, end quote. The hope that Melville feels with respect to national and global futures has a similar and similarly unstable basis. There's much, maybe too much, to overcome. Too much suffering, too much stasis, too much uniformity. And yet something in Melville cannot help believing that something like a fire, like the wind, can transfigure the world's pyramidical consolidations of power. In an 1852 letter to Nathaniel Hawthorne, he calls the Blithedale romance, Hawthorne's recently published satire of utopian aspirations, an antidote to the mooniness of some dreamers who are merely dreamers. Yet who the devil ain't a dreamer? End quote. What is politics without utopia? What is life without dreaming? And what good is any perspective on existence that does not take in the testimony of every self-extending thing around us, that does not seek to join each of those testimonies imaginatively in an upward clasp? Over there is the pyramid, massive, symmetrical, and unitary. Over there somewhere. Over here, however, in a more intimate region of Melville's mind, is a subtle, insistent counter-display. Scud, overleaping the rock against which a wave has broken. Grass upsprouting between the seams of flagstones. A horse riderless and rearing. A beetle struggling through a crack. Coral insects building reefs. Baffled shoots groping into the air. A worm turning under the heel. A whale shooting lengthwise from the sea. A leaf escaping from its prison. The budding sod, the budding dawn. A coffin upbursting from a shipwreck on which one can, for a little while, float. Thank you.
We've got 10 minutes for questions.
Yes?
It's not a question, but I recently read it. Hams are definitely hamstrings. There you go.
I'm really glad to know that.
Ishmael's breaking into the room because Queequeg hasn't answered the door. Good heavens, there sat Queequeg, altogether cool and self-collected, right in the middle of the room, squatting on his hands.
Squatting on his hands, yeah, that comes up twice.
And there's a passage about the people of Queequeg's land, the kings and higher-ups, fattening up the lower masses to use as ottomans and sofas.
In the swampy areas, yeah. Making things up.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful lecture, and I love the poetic way you are exploring Melville and also sharing some very subtle and nuanced insights about all kinds of process of thinking and reading. So I wondered, in the case of Moby Dick, how much is this open-ended and ongoing process of thinking that you're talking about connected to the voyage, the voyage of Moby Dick, and particularly contrasting with, you mentioned Marianne's static world, where there's not movement. Is that important to Melville, and does that play out in other works as well as Moby Dick, where the journey is such a dominating part of the narrative?
Yeah, it really does. Thank you for the question. It's this afternoon I was spent most of it by the river, like watching the river run. It's got a great current, and I like rivers, and Melville likes rivers. He likes the opening of Moby Dick, the first chapter, is not just about how everyone's attracted to water, but how they're attracted to water in motion, like the water you see in fountains and rivers. He has a sense that life has a kind of tendency to sort of settle and consolidate if it's not animated by some sort of means. One of the things, the voyage is like a really essential kind of like image for him, and it's connected to images of flowing and of growth, and also just say just the kind of like experiences of exuberance. I've gotten really interested in the kind of biology of exuberant play. It's something that you can see in, among non-human animals, and the non-human animals that are engaged in that kind of motion and that kind of like playful, exuberant activity are way more social than the ones who are not. This is true with two species of seals that are very closely related. One's highly social, one's not, and it's the one that they play in that kind of like exuberant, fictional sort of way. The others don't. It's true of species of foxes too. And so it is for Melville like this desire to see things in motion, have things in motion. It's something that is not just a sort of it's something that almost like comes out of his sense of what it means to be a being in the world. And so to go back to what Steve was saying initially, like I don't read Melville as a kind of titanic brain, like an intellect like hovering over all of us and taunting us for not being as smart as him, which is sometimes like I think how people perceive him or other canonical authors. He has a animating sense of being amidst a world that's in motion and a world that's always in danger of seeming to stop. And it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that it continues to seem to stop when it is in fact actually everywhere and always in motion. And one of the sort of like tragedies of like Melville's career is that one can only write if one has readers. That the motion of writing is not something that can be sustained indefinitely just in privacy. It requires some kind of, even imaginatively, some kind of sense of something outside oneself. And Melville increasingly lost that. Yeah.
I was reminded of with the Queequeg scene that there, I believe I have the quote right, that Ishmael says he'd rather sleep with a drunk Hannibal than a sober Christian.
Yes.
And that phrase has stuck with me for a long time. But in this wonderful talk that you gave, you sort of opened up this sense of otherness that I hadn't placed in Melville. That particular passage I mentioned, or that little quote, was pretty dead strong on his sort of point of view. But it seems like he was a lot more complex than that and a lot more open than what he was looking at. But there's that hint, that religious sort of punch there. Do you see that in his other works as well?
Oh yeah. By the religious punch, you mean just the drunken Christian. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of what he's saying is that it's he experience is highly particular. Everything comes one at a time. Every event is distinctive, and so like it's not whether you can't decide by looking at someone and knowing if they're white or non-white or Christian or cannibal that they're someone you would want to spend a night with. And so it's only something that comes out of again that process of making something of Queequeg. And so I should say like one of the things I'm focusing on is sort of like I'm not focusing on the noun phrases because like Ishmael is in Melville's imagination. Ishmael is like in some sense like raised in this kind of like white culture where he's used to saying things like head peddling, purple rascal or things like that, and so it's not surprising that he says such things, and it's almost like unavoidable or inescapable. But what's almost unique, like I sort of like, I mean, I've read a lot of 19th century literature. I've never read anybody who keeps things moving in this kind of perceptual, interpretive way with non-white characters in the way that Melville does. I'm focusing again on the transitive dimensions of the scene, the movement from one perception interpretation to the next, and again thinking about that as a kind of resource for the future. The big question is, what's the value of Herman Melville? What can we go back to and find in him that we can bring forward into our future? And you may have noticed that there are things I was talking about here that have to do with the present and the future. Yeah. I didn't think I was being subtle. Yeah.
When you were speaking of the, let me start it in a different way. I actually got a perception that I'd never gotten before as I began to read your book, and it was like the vulnerability of Melville.
Yeah.
I never visited that before, and you just hit upon it just a moment ago when you were saying that we're always in danger of it freezing up, and I can't deal with that. You know, that's like death or something. But the idea of him as just a vulnerable person who's trying to deal with that, as opposed to pontificating.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really, really important feature of Melville. It's something that Melville himself talked about. He described himself, you know, as having in a letter to Hawthorne, as having a susceptible and peradventure feeble temperament. You know, and he's saying this may be a crazy letter. If so, ascribe to the effects of the latter half of June on the susceptible and feeble temperament. And he said it's a sign of strength to be weak and be out with it, and just say that you are. You know, I mean, like, he knew, or he sensed. It's like just I don't. It's a basic, almost like obvious kind of like point that we are all vulnerable. We are all mortal. We weren't born with selves. We developed in them, and so they're just these historical creations that are not founded in anything beyond the kind of like that, you know, that period of time. And so it's in some sense like, you know, he will continually say, like, you know, when he says like we're all like cracked about the head and sadly need mending, like in Moby Dick. It's that kind of like crackedness that he thinks could bring us closer together. You know, it's if there's one thing that unites us, it's that we're kind of cracked. You know, but it does take a strange kind of strength to acknowledge that, and that's what Melville does.
Okay, our hour is up. Thank you, Geoffrey, very much.
Thank you all.
Copies of The Value of Herman Melville are available back here if you'd like to purchase one. And we've got plenty of drinks and refreshments in the back if you'd like to hang out and talk and approach Professor Sanborn individually. Please feel free to.
Yeah, I'm approaching.